All right, good morning, everybody. It's a minute after 9:30. I think we can get started. If you would, please bow with me as we go to God in prayer before our Bible study this morning. Father in heaven, we thank you for this day that you've given us. We thank you for all of our many blessings. We're thankful for the opportunity that we have to come here and to worship you and to study and to learn from another portion of thy word. Lord, we pray that we'll take the things that we learned here today, we can apply them to our lives, be better Christians in the future. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, so this morning is actually the first lesson in a set of series. We've decided to take on the topic of 1 Thessalonians for our Sunday morning Bible studies. So hopefully that will give some uniformity to kind of the things that we're talking about and that we're looking at in our Bible studies. And so we're going to be focused on 1 Thessalonians for the next couple of weeks. This morning I have been tasked with giving you some background on 1 Thessalonians, which is somewhat easy to do. I would say easy. There's nothing ever easy, I guess, in life. But there's really some basic stuff about the Thessalonians and about Thessalonica and about the region in which it is set that is important, and it's important in the context of being able to understand the rest of the epistle and the rest of the letter that is written. So we probably need to start with just some basic stuff, basic things that you need to know as you go forward throughout the book of 1 Thessalonians to understand kind of what's going on here. We know from several different reference points that Paul is the writer here. He's the primary writer. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 18, we read there, it says, "Therefore we wanted to come to you, even I, Paul, time and again, but Satan hindered us." So we know that there's a reference to we and then I. Those two things don't really match up with one another, I understand, but it'll make sense in just a second. But we know that when he's talking in I, that's Paul writing there. So Paul is the one that is writing this letter. So understand that as we go forward, that it is Paul. But in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy to the church of the Thessalonians and God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ." So here again is some more of these introductory facts and just things to know about the background of the book and of the letter, is that Paul is accompanied by Silas and by Timothy. When it says Silvanus, that's Silas. That's who you would commonly know as Silas. So he is accompanied by Silas and Timothy as he writes this, but understand he is the writer. These people Silas and Timothy are with him as they were for various different points of his second missionary journey, and they're with him as he wrote this epistle to the Thessalonians. We know that they were with him at several points during this missionary journey to the Thessalonians. We'll look at that in context here as we go forward with this introductory study. But again, at this point of his writing, they are certainly there with him as it is written. So one of the main questions that I have is in understanding when this letter would have been written, because that's important in understanding kind of the context in which it's set and the context in which the world around them exists in Thessalonica. Many of the scholars believe that this book was written somewhere between the years AD 50 and AD 53, which probably does line up with some of the other time frames that are put on Paul's missionary journeys. Typically, if we see Paul as the writer of something, or if I see Paul as the writer of something, you may feel differently about this. But if I see Paul as the writer of something, I ask the question of, is he in prison or out of prison? Because there are times when Paul writes from prison. There's times when he writes from bonds, as he says. This is not one of those times. Paul is free at this point, it seems. He does not seem to be imprisoned, but he certainly is not in a... He's certainly on the run, I would say. I would say at this point he's more or less a fugitive, might be the best way to describe him. Somebody would like for him to be in prison, in other words. There are a group of people that would like for Paul to be imprisoned as he writes this, but he is not. But if you peg this if you peg this letter as being written between AD 50 and AD 53, that would make this letter one of the earliest writings that's found in the New Testament. The book of James might probably be older than it, but this would certainly put the letter to the Thessalonians as one of the earliest writings in the New Testament. It is thought by many, and I've joined this thought, that this letter was written while Paul was in Corinth, which, if you look at the way that the progression went of Paul's second missionary journey, and again, we'll look at this in more detail, but it would have been written pretty early after the church in Thessalonica was established. This was really a letter that was written to a group of new converts, maybe not necessarily new converts, but a newly established church, a newly established group of Christians there in Thessalonica. And so it's thought that, again, that this book, the letter from Paul to the Thessalonians, was written between the years AD 50 and 53 while Paul was in Corinth on his second missionary journey. That's the general thought of when this letter would have been written. We know that this is possible because in Acts chapter 18 and verse 1, we read this. In Acts chapter 18 and verse 1, this is where Paul is in Corinth. But after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And we'll see why Athens is important in just a second. But Athens is important because this is where Paul went after they fled. When Paul and Silas flee Thessalonica and they go to Berea, when the Jews from Thessalonica come to Berea to attack them further, they leave and go to Athens. And we'll look at that. But after he goes to Athens, he goes to Corinth. And I have a map, I think, that will help explain all this, I hope. But they departed, and so they're there in Corinth. And then in verse 5 it says, when Silas and Timothy had come from Macedonia, Paul was compelled by the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus is the Christ, which is what he did pretty much everywhere he went. But Silas and Timothy, we can see here from Acts chapter 18, we know through that context that Silas and Timothy are with Paul in Corinth. And so that's why I think it makes sense to say that this letter would have been written while Paul is in Corinth with Silas and Timothy. Now understand, Acts chapter 17 is the primary source that we have on context of what happened in Thessalonica when the church was established. And as you know, we studied that not that long ago. We all looked here in this class about the attack on Jason's house. And I don't want to spend we need to revisit it, and we need to look at it from the context of how can we apply this to the First Thessalonians as a whole. But understand, we've talked about this recently. This should be familiar to you about what happened to the Christians at Thessalonians in Thessalonica before the church was established. But before we delve back into this Acts 17, which again is important because it's the context in the Scripture that we have for the establishment of the church in Thessalonica, we need to know a little bit more about the place that Thessalonica is just on the map in terms of the geography and the culture and things that are there. Understand that Thessalonica was not a pig trail town. This was not some kind of just like hole-in-the-wall place where, one or two people live and there's like a bunch of tents and stuff like that. Thessalonica was a major city. This was a major metropolitan. This was a major city in the Roman Empire. This is a huge deal. Thessalonica is not an inconsequential city. Even today, it is still a major player in the Roman Empire. It was a huge get for them when they conquered Macedonia. Its history really centers around the three famous words that any business developer says, which is location, location, location. Thessalonica is in the perfect location. It is in a great location for trade. It is in a great location to be able to help establish commerce and to establish funds for your city. It is in a great place for defense. It is in a great place at that time for war. It is in a difficult place to be attacked because of where it lies. It's a port city. As you know, throughout history, port cities are very important for trade and for commerce. It's a port city that's along the northern part of the Mediterranean Sea. Again, I have a map that I think will help us with this. It connects much of Europe to the Middle East. It was really something that connected the Roman Empire to the in the stretches of from Rome to Constantinople, it was something that stretched and helped connect those things together. In addition to it being a port city, which of course is important for travel and for commerce, it also was conveniently located along what they called the Via Ignatia or the Via Ignata. This is a road that the Romans built to promote trade and also for them to be able to access the far east part of their empire. This was a very important road. It's a road that still exists in part today. It was a road that was built here along, in 50 and 53 A.D. Even before then, it is still there today. There are still parts of that that exist even today. The road begins in modern-day Albania around a city called Durrës, and it stretched all the way to Constantinople. It stretched all the way to what is modern-day Istanbul in Turkey. And so it is a long distance for that road to stretch, and it was what provided the Romans access to the far east of their empire. But it went through Thessalonica, and if you really track Paul's second missionary journey, it tracks the entire places that Paul went to, which stands to reason that Paul used this road to be able to go out and to teach the gospel. Paul used the road that existed to his advantage. Not only was this useful for trade, the primary thing that the Thessalonians would have dealt in at this time was the trade of goat's hair cloth. That was what they were known for in the Thessalonians and the Roman Empire. That was the part that they played was providing goat's hair cloth to people. And still today, it's still a textile town. There's still textiles that are produced in Thessalonica today, as was their tradition. Originally, this city would have been under the rule of the Macedonian Empire. You think about the Hellenistic Greeks and the Greeks that existed at the time, this city would have been under the rule of the Macedonians for many years until the fall of Macedonia. It was named after a half-sister of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great thought enough of the town to name it after a half-sister. Unfortunately for the Greeks and for the Macedonians, Alexander the Great did not live forever, and he could not continue to be undefeated in military victories, and the Macedonian Empire eventually fell and gave rise to the Roman Empire. And that's just in terms of world history, just to tell you what's going on here at this time. The Romans had divided Macedonia. When Macedonia was conquered, the Romans divided it into four different sectors, four different quadrants, whatever you want to call it, four different provinces. And Thessalonica was the capital of one of their provinces. They thought enough, again, of Thessalonica that it was a capital of one of the provinces for the Romans. This was a free city in the Roman Empire, which meant that it was not controlled necessarily by Rome. Rome oversaw this thing, but there were local leaders. It's kind of, you think about Jerusalem, how Jerusalem had some local leaders and things. Thessalonica is the same way. Same kind of governance. They had local leaders that would have been over this city. They were subject to Roman rule, but they did have they were somewhat autonomous from Rome in that regard. At the time of the writing of these epistles, in terms of who was in power in Rome, the person in power at the time of the writing of Paul would have been Claudius, who was the direct predecessor to Nero. Of course, as you know, Nero was very difficult for Christians. Claudius was less difficult, although he didn't like Christians either. But this was the direct predecessor to Nero. Now, what you'll see if you look on a map is this, and I had this really cool Google PowerPoint where it flew around and did all this cool stuff, and I know nothing about computers, and so you're stuck with these screenshots that I made from this really cool Google thing that I did. I'm going to figure it out one day, but regardless. So, and I've got this pointer now that I can use too. So when I use this pointer, you can see this is Thessalonica. This yellow dot that I've got is Thessalonica. These yellow lines are something that a person who's got the computer skills of a 5-year-old did and tried to do it to where he could draw distances. You'll see that in a minute. It'll make sense in just a minute. But this is Thessalonica. And what you can see on this is if you're familiar with looking at a Google map, is all this stuff right here, these are all houses. These are residences. These are buildings. This is development. That's how big this city is even today. It's huge. This is a gigantic metropolitan that exists in Greece today. These are mountains on either side. This is farmland that's low-lying. And this, of course, is the north part of the Mediterranean Sea. You can think about it from from the perspective of a warring kind of, in the first century, how difficult it would have been to have conquered this city, and how difficult and what purpose it would have provided for defense. Surrounded by a mountain on this side, surrounded by water on this side. There's not a good way to get to it just from a strategic standpoint in terms of war. And of course, for commerce, we got major roads and water that follows in there. It's a very populated city still today. It is the second largest city in the modern day Greece. So it's the second largest city in Greece behind Athens. Athens today still is the most populous city in Greece. Thessalonica is the second largest city. Still today a port city, and again right at the end of the line of the Mediterranean Sea. Now I'm going to show you in just a minute. This is Rome. Of course, Rome is the rule. This will make sense in just a second. Again, this was a lot cooler when it was like flying around and showing how far in distance these things were. And then this is Jerusalem, and again, this will make sense in just a second because it was really cool when I had all the distances and stuff. Okay, so this here in the middle is Thessalonica. Okay, and Rome is over here. So you see the distance between Rome and Thessalonica. It's over 500 miles away from Thessalonica to Rome, and you see an ocean separates these, or a sea separates these things. And so again, Rome had some difficulty in being able to be there constantly. It wasn't like they could just keep their finger on them. That's why they had these local rulers, because they're so far away. And again, in context, Jerusalem, we talk a lot about Jerusalem in our Bible studies. Jerusalem is over 900 miles away. Jerusalem is roughly the same distance from here to New York City from where Thessalonica is. Those two things are far apart. So we see the context where this is at. You see this is the Mediterranean Sea that connects all of Europe to Africa and to the Middle East. And Greece, this is modern day Greece that's right here, this whole little thing right here. And Thessalonica is up in the northern part of Greece, which would have been Macedonia. And so that is where Thessalonica is located at. Now, these other dots are parts of Paul's second missionary journey, and they start to form right along that road that I was telling you about. And I've got a more zoomed-in picture of this in just a second. Down here in the south, these two dots, Corinth is right here on the left, and that is Athens to the right. And so that is the distance between Corinth and Athens and Thessalonica. In terms of just getting an idea about where these things are located on a map, this is the best way that I know how to do it. And of course, as you can see, like over here, just to get your context, this is Spain and Portugal that are over here. This is the northern part of Africa. And of course, like over here is Iraq and Iran, and parts of West Russia are up here all the way to Ukraine. So just in terms of modern day thinking about where these places are at, that's where they're at. So in general, I just want you to have a context about where these things are. Now, again, we heard not long ago in the story of Acts 17 and the story that's laid out there, the political atmosphere that existed in Thessalonica at the time. But again, we need to revisit that. We need to relook at this. If we're going to study 1 Thessalonians moving forward, we've got to be able to understand this. At the end of Acts 16 is really where this starts, because again, there's no chapter breaks in the original text. But at the end of Acts 16, Paul and Silas are in a Philippian jail. That we are familiar with the account of Paul and Silas and their interaction with the Philippian jailer. It's a story that we're all familiar with. And after the conversion of the Philippian jailer, Paul and Silas are released, but there's something that happens there. So in Acts 16, 35 through 39, we read this. It says, "And when it was day, the magistrates sent the officers, saying, 'Let those men go.' So the keeper of the prison reported these words to Paul, saying, 'The magistrates have sent to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace.' But Paul said to them, 'They have beat us openly, uncondemned Romans, and have thrown us into prison. And now do they put us out secretly? No, indeed, let them come themselves and get us out.' And the officers told these words to the magistrates, and they were afraid when they heard that they were Romans. Then they came and pleaded with them and brought them out and asked them to depart from the city." Paul and Silas in jail have been beaten by the Romans, imprisoned, and not convicted of anything, are put into jail, but eventually they're told to leave. They are released from jail. You're free to go. Please leave. Please get out of here. Don't come back. You don't have to go home. You can't stay here. That's what they're told. But that is not what happened. Paul is the ultimate. There are times when, like Paul, and this is one of those times when he's a little bit of like he's for social justice. Like he is for some things that, hey, you've done me wrong, I'm going to make a scene out of this. And that's what happens here. He says, I'm not leaving. I'm a Roman citizen, and you've beat me, and you've thrown me into prison in violation of Roman law because you cannot treat me this way. You violate all of my rights, and so I'm not leaving. I'm not going to go in silence. I refuse to leave. He's really getting kind of sassy here with them. But eventually they have to come and beg him to leave the prison. They have to come and beg them to, if me or you were in prison and somebody came and opened the prison door and said, hey, it's time to go, we would pack our stuff up and we would leave and we would never look back. And we would say, hey, I'm not coming back to this place. But Paul is not that way. Paul says, I'm not leaving, and he has to be begged to leave the prison. But eventually he does. Eventually Paul leaves the prison, and what we see is this. He begins this journey to Thessalonica. And so in Acts 17 and verse 1 it says, now when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. So on the map again, this up here is Philippi. So this is Philippi. This is where Paul and Silas are imprisoned with the Philippian jailer. And so they're here in Philippi. And then what it says in Acts 17 verse 1 is he goes next to Amphipolis. And so Amphipolis is here a little bit to the south and to the west. Again, what you would notice is those two things are, this again is part of the Mediterranean Sea, which again is what Thessalonica is on. But Philippi up here, they have to travel. This is a mountain. This is a pretty large mountain that's here, so they had to find some way to go around. This was not an easy journey for Paul, somebody who was just released from prison, to walk that entire distance. And again, all these cities are along this same road that I'm talking about. The Via Ignatia would have ran from Philippi, from Amphipolis to Philippi. That was the way that this road was headed. And again, it will make more sense when you zoom out on these things and look at them kind of in context. Then, what 17 and verse 1 said is he goes from Amphipolis to Apollonia. I'm not real good with these names. Are not names that are in Cherokee County. You go from Amphipolis here all the way down to Apollonia, again heading southeast towards Thessalonica. This again is heading towards Thessalonica. We see more mountains, more lakes. We have there's a tough journey that's there, but again, there is a road that connects these things for Paul. These are not insubstantial distances. So as you continue to work directly to the southeast, you eventually head southwest. You eventually head due west. And that is what happens here. So this is what we looked at earlier. This is Thessalonica. This is Apollonia. So this would have been the way that Paul would have traveled in his journey. This is not an insubstantial distance to get from Philippi to Thessalonica. So he begins to go due west. Again, there's that big mountain range that we saw in terms of what is protecting Thessalonica. But that is the way that Paul would have went to get from Apollonia to Thessalonica. All this, mind you, after having been in prison in Philippi and being beaten by the Romans and being treated just very poorly in general. And so in Acts 17, verses 2 through 4, we see here what happens when Paul gets to Thessalonica and as the church is established for the Thessalonians. Acts 17, verses 2 through 4, it says, then Paul, as his custom was, went in to them and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and demonstrating that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and saying, this Jesus, whom I preach to you, is the Christ. And some of them were persuaded, and a great multitude of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women, joined Paul and Silas. So Paul here, as his custom was, and we know from Romans 1 and 16, Paul usually taught the Jews first. This was the way that Paul went about his teaching, was teaching the Jews first, then the Greek. What does he teach the Jews? He teaches them Christ. The Jews that are here in Thessalonica, he teaches them Christ. He teaches them the gospel of Christ. And some of them were persuaded. There were some that were persuaded that joined Paul and Silas, that established the church here in Thessalonica. But we know in verse 5 and verse 6, this didn't last for long because the Jews, there were some Jews that couldn't handle this. It says, but the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace, and gathering a mob, set all the city in an uproar and attacked the house of Jason and sought to bring them out to the people. But when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some brethren to the rulers of the city, crying out, "These who have turned the world upside down have come here too." Now look at what the Jews did here. We've talked about this before again, but again, it's very important that the Jews who did not believe, they drummed up this attack against the household of Jason and against his house. But it wasn't necessarily, this is something that I don't think I would have pointed out in the last study that we had. Just understand, this was not just like Jews that did this. What does it say here? It says that they took some of the evil men from the marketplace. That means that there were some of these people who may not have even been religiously affiliated with Jews. They were just evil. They were just mean. They were just there for a paycheck to be able to go and attack something. They were just drummed up and paid off by some of these Jews to some extent. It was just people that were doing evil because they were evil, not necessarily because they had some kind of religious conviction. We don't know much about Jason other than it's safe to assume that he harbored Paul and Silas. Because of what it says in verse 7. It says Jason has harbored them, and these are all acting contrary to the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. And they troubled the crowd and the rulers of the city when they heard these things. So when they had taken security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. So the charge that was levied against Jason and against his family was the same thing basically, or the charge that was levied against Paul and Silas is the same thing as levied against Jesus, right? That he is preaching that there is another king. They're preaching that there is somebody who is in power that is not our wonderful Claudius or our wonderful Caesar, and therefore they should be put to death. That is the same charge that existed against Jesus, just in really a different kind of variety and a different form almost. But notice this. Notice that throughout this, Paul and Silas did not cause a disturbance. It wasn't like they were out there in the streets picketing, and doing stuff and stirring up trouble. And it really wasn't even like Paul when he's released from the Philippian jail to say, "Hey, I'm not leaving." He's not doing stuff like that. The people that are causing the problem are these unruly Jews. The unruly Jews are the ones that are causing all of these problems. When it says that it troubled the crowd and the rulers, that is talking about the Jews. It's not talking about Paul and Silas. They weren't the ones causing the trouble. The ones causing the trouble are the Jews here. The ones causing trouble are the ones that have set off this mob to try to attack Jason and his household. And so in Acts 17 and verse 10, I do want to point out that it says when they had taken security from Jason, that's talking about a bond. That's talking about what we would equivalent to a modern bond in our society today. Now, Jason probably didn't pay them money to make them go away. I would assume here that is probably what happens in verse 10, which is Jason assured them that he would get Paul and Silas out of town. That would have been a bond that could have existed at that time. Acts 17 and verse 10, it says, "Then the brethren immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea. And when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews." So we see that Paul and Silas, they have to leave Thessalonica by night. It's not safe for you to travel by day. You got to go under cover of nightfall to be able to get away from this angry mob. But what did they do when they left? Paul, again, as his custom was to teach the Jews first, when they arrived, they went into the synagogue of the Jews. Paul immediately left this place where he had been in danger, his life had been in danger of being killed or being imprisoned, and he immediately goes and preaches again to the Jews, which is an interesting, and it shows a lot about Paul's character, I think, to say that he was willing to go and do that after what had just happened to him. So this is the map between Thessalonica and Berea, where Paul and Silas would have left in dark of night to escape the angry Jews. This is Thessalonica, and Berea is over here to the west, a distance of about 50 miles that he would have had to have traveled to get there. And as you can see, there's several different cities now that exist between there. I don't think they would have been as populated then as they are now. But it was not an inconsequential distance. And it's important to understand the distance between these two things and the look on the map of how that appears because of what the Jews do next. Acts 17, 11 through 13, it says, "These were more fair-minded than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness and searched the Scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. Therefore many of them believed, and also not a few of the Greeks, prominent women as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was preached by Paul at Berea, they came there also and stirred up the crowds." So we see, and we remember this from when we studied this before, the Jews in Thessalonica, the angry Jews in Thessalonica, they were so stirred up by what Paul and Silas had taught that they traveled all that distance that you just saw on that map right there. to go and disrupt them from teaching the gospel even more. That is how angry they were about what was going on in their city, that they traveled somewhere else to go and try to take care of this problem that they perceived in the gospel being taught. Verse 14 and verse 15 says, "Then immediately the brethren sent Paul away to go to the sea, but both Silas and Timothy remained there. So those who conducted Paul brought him to Athens, and receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him with all speed, they departed." So again, it's important to point out this, and going back to verse 13 really, that this was the context in which this letter to the Thessalonians is written. That they are in a terrible predicament where there is a group of Jews that are so anti the cause of Christ they're willing to go somewhere else to disrupt the cause of Christ being taught. That is the world that they are living in at this time when Paul writes this letter to them in 1 Thessalonians. And we know from verse 14 and verse 15 that as soon as they get to Berea and they disrupt the teaching there, they disrupt it. Paul leaves and he goes a great distance away to go to Athens because he is clearly in danger. So again, this is another map of the overview just to show how far Paul would have went to get away from this. He would have went all the way. Our journey really begins in Acts 16 in Philippi. He's in Philippi, he's all the way up here, he's in jail there, and he goes from there to Amphipolis, to Apollonia, and then to Thessalonica, to Berea. And when he escapes Berea, he goes all the way here to Athens. And as you can see, that is a great distance from Athens to Berea. That is where Paul escaped to, and eventually his travels take him from Athens to Corinth, which is where this letter to the Thessalonians is written. And so I just want to point out to you this major road that existed through Thessalonica and think about the way that it runs. This is Durrës. This is where the Via Egnatia would have began in modern-day Albania, and it would have traveled all the way here through Berea, up through Thessalonica, to Philippi, all the way over here to Istanbul, which would have been Constantinople, which is in modern-day Turkey. And so that is how far that road would have went. And again, the importance of it, as you could see through trade and what it would have meant to the Thessalonians. And again, this is Mediterranean Sea. And you can just see what kind of little nook that Thessalonica sits in as far as that goes on the sea. I think that it's a really interesting thing to point out as far as the context and the geography that existed in Thessalonica at this point and how that would have helped them politically and just in terms of economic-wise. And to show, this was probably not a city necessarily. There would have been people that would have been established there, but it also was a city that many would have traveled through. It was a city where there would have been many passersby, many people that were just traveling through to go somewhere else. So the whole background of that is to really set this political atmosphere that exists in Thessalonica at this point when the letter is written. You have a newly established church Paul is writing to. See in Acts 17, the establishment of that church, the gospel being taught in Thessalonica. You've got a church that's pretty well brand new there, pretty well brand new in relatively speaking, with a very angry and a very volatile group of Jews that are opposed to the gospel. And so that's the general overview that you've got, that this group of Thessalonians that Paul is writing to they're relatively new in the faith, they're relatively new to the teaching of Christ, and they're surrounded by a violent group of Jews that are opposed to this newly established faith that they've got. And so what you'll see as you study 1 Thessalonians is that's kind of an underlying theme that exists throughout the book. That it's kind of like a letter that you'd write to a new Christian. It's like a new letter like a letter of encouragement to say, hey, I'm there with you. I'm struggling with you. I've got these things that are going on in my life. I'm dealing with these same things you are. This is how I deal with it. Some of the general topics that Paul will touch on throughout the book. I want to give you a couple of thoughts on the book as a whole as we move forward. I like sometimes to have an outline of a book. I think an outline is sometimes nice. I pulled an outline. I'm not smart enough to give you an outline myself. Trust me, I'm not that smart. I can't reinvent the wheel that way. And so I found this outline that I really liked, and I wanted to share it with you. It's from David Lipscomb's commentary on the epistle. This is a pretty old commentary that I have. It's from, I think maybe from the 1940s or something, but it's a really nice commentary. And he breaks it down into two sections, and then he breaks down the sections even further. And so his first section that he describes for this is that section 1, which is the majority of the book, from chapter 1 all the way through the middle of verse 3, or the middle of chapter 3, says, he describes it as Paul's past and present relations with the Thessalonians and his love for them. And what you will see as you go throughout 1 Thessalonians is Paul talks a lot about how much he loves the Thessalonians. He really likes the Thessalonians. He really admires them and their character and the way that they deal with things. And he really has a lot of love for them. But he's also going to talk about some of the troubles that he had in getting there to them. He's going to talk about some of the difficulties that he had in coming to visit them despite his love. And then the second is exhortations against vice and comfort and warnings in view of the coming of Christ. There's a little bit of talk after, which begins in chapter 4 through the end of the book in chapter 5. There's a lot of talk about the second coming of the Lord. There's some of this that will be a little bit complicated when we talk about the second coming of the Lord. That's towards the end of the book, but it is there. He breaks down section 1 into a couple of different sections. Again, this is just for your reference in terms of being able to have a roadmap to see what's coming throughout the book. But in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 1, he describes that as the salutation and greeting, which you've already read, which is, hey, this is us, this is who you are, hello, how are you today? That's the salutation and the greeting that's there. Again, talks about how much he loves them, how much he's thankful for them, how much how much he admires their character, and reminds them, again, of the character of his life and ministry among them. That is important because these two sufferings, these two things right here that reminds them of the characters of his life and ministry among them, and the sufferings of them are the same as those endured. They're the same as those that Paul endured too. That he's out teaching the gospel because people want to imprison him. Same thing for the Thessalonians. Because of this political atmosphere they had, that would have not been a foreign concept to them to have thought about being imprisoned or being harmed because of what you believe in. And again, he talks about efforts to go and see them and about sending Timothy to go and learn the state of the church. Just to say that, hey, I kept up on you. Section 2 is broken down a little bit further as well. There are warnings against impurity that are there. There are things, just general things. Hey, you need to watch out for these things. There is a part of the letter where Paul has to talk about, like he does in every letter, talk about the different flaws and the shortcomings and things that, hey, you need to work on these things. You need to try to correct these things in your life. And so one of the things that the Thessalonians deal with, and you'll see it when we get to chapter 4, is this. They deal with something that we all deal with, which is loss. They deal with death in the church, and what does that mean? How do we deal with those kind of things? And Paul gives them some good lessons on that. And again, that's how we get into the context of dealing with the second coming of the Lord, and the ways to watch for that. And so that's pretty much it as far as what to expect moving forward from 1 Thessalonians. I don't know that I'm teaching this next Sunday, but at some point I'll jump back into this study on 1 Thessalonians. But I wanted to give you a good kind of primer on the Thessalonians and what they dealt with and what to look at in terms of what Paul would have been writing to them about. I think it's important to understand in the context and in the time frame in which this was wrote. Paul's writing would have been in a time when they were new Christians, and they would have been under attack kind of all around them in the world by people who did not believe the same way that they did. And that's the really important thing to draw from the Thessalonians, and that they were in a big city. They were not just like out in the middle of nowhere. These were people that were in very civilized society at the time. And so that's all the thoughts I've got for you this morning. I appreciate your attention, and we'll end class there.